que tuvo un gran impacto en su área y actualmente se encuentra trabajando en un proyecto de libro titulado Crimes of All Humanity, Revolution and the Modern Novel. De este último trabajo surge lo que nos va a contar aquí hoy. Puede parecer que todo esto nos quede un poco lejos cuando pensamos desde el corpus de las literaturas transicionales en Europa, pero vamos a ver que Michele nos va a traer una serie de herramientas conceptuales que nos van a servir a la hora de pensar las novelas más allá de la idea de representación, es decir, que nos van a servir para pensar las novelas como artefactos ficcionales que tienen usos políticos, en la línea de lo que Marta Pouchant nos contaba ayer en su presentación. So, Michele, I was saying that in your work you examine the history of art novel and its connections to left-wing political violence in the Anglophone context specifically, and also compared with the 19th century Russian novel and also African and African-American late 20th century novel. And I was also saying that even though your field may seem a bit far away from the European political transitional literature, which is what we are discussing here, your work on the political uses of literary fiction, specifically notions like crime fiction and also the notions of futurity, utopian crime, and also the problems of the notion of representation in literary studies. These notions are very connected with the discussion we had yesterday at Marta Pouchant's session about the notions of scale and global space. So thank you so much for being here with us, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited for the conversation. This morning, rereading my talk, I was feeling that my title might have been a little bit more belligerent than I intended. I'm not sure I'm really talking about the limits of democracy so much as the limits of a few ways in which sort of a presumptively democratic theory infects our understanding of both politics and the novel. So I'll see. I'm looking forward to hearing what you think. How will we look in the eyes of history? Perhaps future historians will mark the moment in which I'm speaking as an inflection point on a steepening slope towards fascism around the world, or they might detect the beginnings of a radical revolt. Maybe either perspective will seem quaint and provincial. Maybe the only story left to tell about us will be the global environmental disaster into which we are plunging the future moment by moment as we sit here. But ultimately, I don't know how history will judge us. When commentators bother to ask that question aloud, they often take an answer for granted. Voices across the political spectrum cloak themselves in a chameleonic mantle labeled the right side of history, as if the future's concerns were so easily comprehensible to us today. Yet many of the actions we take, from creating art to voting to political activism, require guesses about how we will be measured by the audience of the future. When we imagine ourselves judged by the eyes of history, we are not judged by a blind justice. We are ourselves blind, judged by a hidden gaze. The Klee monoprint in which Walter Benjamin would find his angel of history has dark pupils set in wide whites. You think, as you look at it, that you can guess that the line of its glance, slightly to its left, perhaps, and you might try to read its expression. But the gaze of the future to us is blank, like ancient bronze sculptures whose ivory inlays have turned to dark holes. The distance of time makes an expression illegible. We do not know where its glance falls in our world. We can only guess at the judgment lurking in the dark. To act on behalf of the future is also to make claims for it, to guess at the shape of the mold into which time flows. Acting risks a kind of failure of the imagination, the inscription of our own limitations onto a world that might not resemble us at all. And yet we can't help but make these guesses when we write, when we speak out, when we protest. Or in the novels I'm addressing today, when we assassinate an aristocrat or plant a bomb or kill someone who might be a police informant. The stakes of the judgment of the future become very high when the action being contemplated is violent, when characters or historical figures take it upon themselves to decide that some lives can be sacrificed for others, and make a utilitarian calculation that bloodshed today might be justified by the future it could help create. The term I use to describe this subject is utopian crime. This is revolutionary action before a revolution is in full swing, violence that isn't yet backed up by the masses. For the characters who commit such crimes, the ends justify the means, or at least they hope so. The project from which this talk is drawn stems from the historical fact that there is a coherent, interconnected tradition of novels on this subject, novels from modernist England to post-apartheid South Africa, which affiliate both with each other and with the same canon of 19th century Russian literature, particularly Dostoevsky and Turgenev. Key figures include Henry James, Joseph Conrad, Ralph Ellison, James Baldwin, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, J.M. Coetzee, and Andre Brink. This project plays out the 20th century consequences of a particular development in Anglophone modernism, the advent of the widespread assumption that the novel could be an art form equal to poetry or painting, not only or even primarily popular entertainment. Today, I'll suggest that one of the defining features of this development with lasting consequences is that the late 19th century constitutes the moment the Anglophone novel began to take for granted that it could be aimed for the future as much or more than the present. Rather than see this development as a flight from historical engagement, the simultaneous rise of utopian crime in fiction, I'm arguing, shows that the idea of producing novels for the future entangles reading and writing with the ethical stakes of seeing oneself as responsible to history. These dynamics persist well beyond the early 20th century moment, which I'll foreground today. Take Andre Brink's 1988 novel, States of Emergency. The opening pages sketch out a panoramic view of late 80s South Africa. At the end of the list, an asterisk by the name P.W. Botha leads to a footnote, which reads, "At the time of writing, State President of the Republic of South Africa," but an explanatory footnote is necessary, as future readers may not remember. Brink's note suggests that the audience of his novel is not the readership of the late 80s, but of some hypothetical and perhaps distant future. And by calling this future audience to our imagination and to the imagination of readers in 1988 and every year in between, Brink tacitly creates a quite specific future for them, one in which the leading emblem of apartheid is reduced literally to a footnote to history. Brink's next novel, An Act of Terror, is about a plot to kill Botha, a more literal erasure from history. The footnote is aimed most immediately not at us, but at all those readers in 1988 and the years surrounding it. It tells them this: imagine a future beyond apartheid. This sort of footnote is a bit of orthography mostly familiar to us from formats in which we encounter books now canonized as classic, the explanatory note decoding long out-of-date references for modern readers. In Brink's version, this orthography becomes a political tool that works by alluding to the novel's potential aesthetic status. What seems like a peculiarly literary problem, how to write a novel that won't go out of date, is also a mode of calling the present-day audience to account before the eyes of history. The modernist novels and its successors, with and without utopian crime, demand readings that make their audience feel the spectral presence of other absent audiences. They refuse to let us settle into our existence today. Instead, they ask us to implicate ourselves in the task of constructing and committing to the future that eventually will judge us and our writing alike. I'm going to argue today that at least when we take as our example the Anglophone novel, the prospect of radical left-wing violence helped give birth to the idea that the novel could be written for the future. And this origin point has shaped the subsequent history and the political uses of literary fiction in profound ways. Henry James and most of the other authors we associate with this moment of transition were not themselves political radicals, but I'll argue that they found in the assassins, bomb throwers, and executioners of utopian crime secret sharers for their own ambitions as artists. It's easy to assume that the novels of utopian crime, constantly alluding to one another, deeply conscious of their connections to the whole tradition of which they are a part, are an aberration in the history of the form. Most novels do not feature acts of revolutionary violence. We read The Princess Casamassima, James's one entry in the genre, as an outlier in his long career of marriage plots and anti-plots. Most people still identify Joseph Conrad more with tales of shipboard life like Heart of Darkness and Lord Jim than they do with his land-based novels of utopian crime, The Secret Agent and Under Western Eyes. Yet I'd suggest that, far from exceptional outliers, the novels of political violence suggest something important about the novel as a whole since the late 19th century, and about the way novels relate to politics, even novels whose political dimensions do not seem visible on the surface. From the moment novelists imagined themselves as producing works for the future as well as the present, they found themselves uneasily akin to precisely the political figures they often wished to disdain and decry, the perpetrators of violence for the sake of the future, the assassins who claimed that the ends justify the means. The author, it turns out, like the assassin, appeals to the judgment of the future against the present. Amanda Claybaugh has written of the moment the protagonist of The Princess Casamassima turns away from a crowded bar to join a conspiracy. The protagonist moves out of a realist domain, she says, and enters a world of abstraction, of inference, of deictic gestures as compulsive as they are incomplete, a mode appropriate to political conspiracy and characteristic of late James. I wouldn't draw such a bright line down the middle of the novel, but note how her lists of features could double as a list of the features of modernist fiction in English. Virginia Woolf, after all, is as prone to deixis as Henry James. I'd suggest that Claybal's implication that modernism appears as soon as political conspiracy enters fiction is because modernism represents the advent of futurity into the novel form in English. Futurity is abstract. It is something we can point to but cannot access. It is something we try to develop from what we have, as we might an inference. As the Anglophone novel slowly began to theorize its own consciousness of the judgment of history, authors confronted an increasingly compelling sequence of analogies between the work of writing art and the work of violent revolution. Like revolutionaries, authors turned to the judgment of the future as superior to the present. They risk instrumentalizing or dismissing the individuals of today, both those whose lives they represent and those who fail to constitute their ideal audience. These analogies are sometimes disturbing for the authors and sometimes thrilling. As a whole, they de-emphasize the function of fiction as a mode of representing society. The novel doesn't just show us the shape of the world we have, or even of the world we might have. In its gambles on the future judgments and its attempts to map paths around the hairpin turns of history, it forces its readers, present and future, to grapple with the dilemmas of political action. In the material that follows, I discuss this primarily with regard to character, with the way violent action tends to make characters non-representative of any particular class or group, and equally non-representative of the future. The assassin, after all, might want history to justify her, but she does not usually desire a future full of assassination. If utopian crime glamorizes its unrepresentative perpetrators, it is uneasy with the limitations of representation when it comes to its victims. For utopian crime to be most easily justified, individuals have to function as neat representatives of regimes. Characters kill aristocrats, colonial officers, or repressive ministers because they want to assault the system they embody. And yet, of course, they're also killing individuals, and worse, innocent civilians might die in the process. The novels of utopian crime challenge the kinds of political action we consider, and they also challenge our sense of what the political functions of literary form might be. The literary forms that surround utopian crime often don't foster analogies with the broad social forms structuring society. They foster analogies more urgently, if more narrowly, with the practical and moral difficulties of trying to live one's life under the blank gaze of history. We might think of the ending of Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Devil on the Cross, where a hail of gunfire marks the protagonist's shift from a narrative of personal survival and self-formation to one of political activism. That violent climax is not the entrance of politics into this novel. Most of its length features the characters coming to understand the political, social, and economic structures in which they live. But it's the moment when the politics of the novel shifts from understanding social forms to acting to change them. In its broadest dimensions, this focus on the problem of political action suggests the limitations of expanded representation as a model of the politics of literature. Much scholarship has been devoted to the ethical imperatives of fiction to try to represent the unrepresentable masses of a population, either through the use of representative individuals or the decentering of the individual as subject. The tradition of utopian crime addresses a different problem. What if representation is not enough? It asks this question both formally, what if doing justice to as many people as possible isn't the novel's goal, and politically, how can an activist try to create a better world when the mass of the people reject her? In my talk today, I'll focus first on this dynamic in the modernist period, when Anglophone novelists received Russian literary accounts of activist struggles with recalcitrant people, and saw in these stories parables of their own struggles with the indifferent mass reading public. At the end of the talk, I'll suggest the consequences of this struggle and political history for a very different cultural context, the anti-apartheid struggle, where activists often could claim with real justice to express the will of disenfranchised masses. Even in this period, I'll show activism seems to challenge representation. Those who choose to become activists risk estranging themselves from the people on whose behalf they attempt to act. Part 1, Terrorism and Reception Theory in Modernism. In focusing on political action rather than the representation of society, utopian crime rapidly confronts the problem of reception. I'll begin with a moment in Joseph Conrad's The Secret Agent, when the professor, a sinister nihilist who walks the street wearing a bomb with his hand always on its detonator to forestall an arrest attempt, finds himself on a crowded street. Conrad writes, "He felt the mass of mankind, mighty in its numbers. They swarmed numerous like locusts, industrious like ants, thoughtless like a natural force, pushing on blind and orderly and absorbed, impervious to sentiment, to logic, to terror too, perhaps." That was the form of doubt he feared most, impervious to fear. Often while walking abroad, when he happened also to come out of himself, he had such moments of dreadful and sane mistrust of mankind. What if nothing could move them? Such moments come to all men whose ambition aims at a direct grasp upon humanity, to artists, politicians, thinkers, reformers, or saints. The professor is a terrorist waiting for his moment. It is then a little strange to see the catalog of potentially more sympathetic figures at the end of this passage: the artist, the politician, the thinker, the reformer, and the saint. What draws them together is the desire for a direct grasp upon humanity. They want, in other words, not just an audience, but an audience who will be moved. The professor wants both to kill the crowd and to have it react to his murderous deed. This concern for the audience was especially salient for early modernist writers like Conrad. Around the time that the novel developed a sense of itself as an art form, something that consciously aspires to be more than entertainment, it also began to struggle to figure out whether and how it could actually appeal to a mass audience. This is also the period that Andreas Huyssin has identified, following Adorno, as the locus of a, quote, great divide. Literature, like other media, saw a newly sharpened rift between elite and popular audiences. One familiar story we tell about this involves the modernist novel's retreat to the audience of the privileged and powerful, or those aspiring to join their ranks. Often we envision this as Mandarin artists erecting walls around the enclosed garden of aesthetic autonomy to keep out the riffraff. The divide, in other words, seems to map onto class distinctions. Mark McGurl, for instance, telling the history of the term the art novel, notes the way the photographic frontispieces of the New York edition of James's novels are full of the closed doorways of monumental houses, suggesting that the volumes themselves are elite objects for elite spaces into which only a few might have access. And yet there was a very different group of thinkers struggling at the same time to figure out how to appeal to an apparently disinterested mass audience. That is, radical revolutionary activists, especially in Russia. Virgin Soil, the novel by Ivan Turgenev that James would adapt in his class war novel, The Princess Casamassima, chronicles the efforts of the populace in 1874 to stir former serfs to revolution. This event was memorialized as a failure. In Turgenev's novel, one revolutionary is betrayed to the police by the people he seeks to agitate, while another accidentally drinks himself insensible in an effort to fit in with them. The protagonist, upon deciding he cannot simplify himself, simplify is the word in Russian, he likes poetry too much to fit in with the working men, commits suicide. Turgenev's novel came out in 1877, but shortly thereafter, some of the real-life populace would turn to violence, most famously Vera Zasulich, who would furnish Oscar Wilde with the protagonist of his first play, and whom Russian commentators connected to the heroine of Turgenev's novel. These efforts culminated in the 1881 assassination of the Tsar. By the time James's novel came out, in other words, the future of Turgenev's revolutionaries seemed clear. When the people failed the revolution would bloodily step out ahead of the people. I won't have a chance to talk in detail about the Princess Casamassima today, but I do want to point out that in one sense, James adapted the plot of Virgin Soil many times after he did most explicitly in that long novel. The basic story is simply that of an aesthetically sensitive young man who desperately seeks to make an impression on a broader, less sensitive world, in part for the eyes of a charismatic, committed woman, a man who fails repeatedly at giving up his aesthetic awareness and ultimately dies for it. That's the 1895 short story, The Next Time, about a novelist who keeps on trying to lower himself to meet the demands of the public, but can only write things that are too accomplished to be popular. Like Turgenev's hero, he cannot simplify himself. James's fiction of the 1880s and 90s is rife with such figures, torn between the public and a love of the aesthetic. The rising walls of the Great Divide are equally, therefore, a story of frustrated dreams of a democratic art novel. We're looking not at authors shutting the doors of their art to the public, but at authors who wish desperately that the public might have some interest in exploring the house of fiction behind the doors. In other words, If The Princess Casimir is James's direct engagement with politics, in its aftermath, he transmuted its representation of revolutionary struggles into the struggles of the artist. And I'd argue this heritage had a lasting impact on how the art novel as a genre after James would imagine its publics and work. James's vision of the vast, abysmal reading public, in other words, isn't just an artist's retreat into Mandarin isolation. It's a struggle with popular complacency that mirrors the struggles of Russian revolutionaries whose literary incarnations had already begun to make their mark on Anglophone writing. The persistence of anxiety about the audience is visible in Conrad's Under Western Eyes, where the assassin Haldon dies because he mistakes his audience. He seeks shelter with the protagonist Razumov, whose reserve in student discussions he interprets as that of a fellow traveler sympathetic to underground movements. Razumov, it turns out, wants nothing more than to succeed in the world as it currently exists and feels himself superior to those around him. He betrays Haldon to the police. The surface similarities between elitism or social striving and radical commitment suggest the necessity of reading carefully past our associations of a narrow audience with financial and social power. If a small group gathers behind closed doors, they might be in a monumental wealthy house or want to be there, but they might also be in a dingy, anonymous room seeking shelter from the police. Conrad, too, loved to praise Turgenev, and no critic has ever taken seriously his disavowal of Dostoevsky's influence. Scholars, including McGurl, Jameson, and Lukács, usually trace the line of descent of the idea of the art novel in English from French exemplars like Flaubert, but we might as easily trace it from Turgenev. And if we restore the Russian heritage to our theory of the development of the Anglophone art novel, it becomes clear that the problem raised by the advent of the art novel is not a temptation to place art above politics or apart from history. The problem is that art and politics, including very extreme left-wing politics, are at risk in very similar ways of identifying themselves as beyond the masses. It's clear by James's late phase and in Conrad's revolutionary fictions that the idea of a thoughtful present-day public for art or for radical ideology seems to have become impossible for these writers. But the way they tell this story sets art's limited audience in parallel, not with a complacent aristocracy hiding behind gleaming walls while the crowds gather outside, but with a very different population, small groups in dingy rooms equally distrustful of the masses. The image of an individual devoted in isolation to a cause, excluding all other forms of human attachment, acting for the eyes of history rather than the acclaim of the moment, is an archetype both of the revolutionary and of the artist. And oddly, the Jamesian artist in particular bears a striking resemblance to the tropes that accumulated around the Russian nihilist over the 1860s and 70s. Take Nechaev's Catechism of a Revolutionary. The revolutionary is a doomed man. He has no interests of his own, no affairs, no feelings, no attachments, no belongings, not even a name. Everything in him is absorbed by a single exclusive interest, by a total concept, a total passion, the revolution. The second list here reinscribes the elements of the first list in the key of abstraction. Affairs, attachments, and belongings become concepts and passions. This is a hollowing out of the structure of human life and personality that paradoxically is alluring, even charismatic. Historically, Nechaev's catechism was very alluring. Many people imitated it, and it circulated widely. Compare, for instance, an older novelist in Henry James's The Lesson of the Master, who speaks to a younger writer about their shared vocation. He, that is the novelist, has nothing to do with the relative. He has only to do with the absolute, and a dear little family may represent a dozen relatives. Then you don't allow him the common passion and affections of men? Paul asked. Hasn't he a passion and affection which includes all the rest? The novelist and Nechaev's revolutionary both absorb the texture of human life into a chosen vocation. They require sacrifice or of love, of fellow feeling for human beings, but they sacrifice in the name of abstract versions of the same thing. The revolutionary values the revolution on behalf of the masses, who in some future might get to live lives with passion and affection. The artist places the representation of passion and affection above their actuality. For another example, take the climactic speech of The Middle Years, one of James's many short stories about dying writers, which appeared in 1893. We work in the dark, we do what we can, we give what we have. Our doubt is our passion, and our passion is our task. The rest is the madness of art. James's artist isn't thinking politically, but there are structural and even syntactical parallels with Nechaev's revolutionary, with an accretive list signifying an at first unstated ideal, culminating in a climactic naming of the ideal, revolution in the one case, art in the other. The man without a name and the man in the dark, working tirelessly and devotedly for a cause that they will never see incarnated, look more alike than different. If I had more time, I would talk about the character who hears that speech in the middle years, who is a young doctor, and in my view, a reimagining of the nihilist Bazarov from Turgenev's Fathers and Children. As Sarah Cole writes of Nechaev's Catechism, it provided an image of the terrorist that was in every sense literary. It both derived from and inspired fictional characters. It very self-consciously imagined the terrorist as a persona, and it carried a strong sense of aura or mood. This is a model of character focused on evacuating the ordinary material of characterization, individual personality, relationships with other people, and complex emotions. If one strand of thinking in James ultimately highlights the artist as a repository of irreducible complexity, other moments like this one suggest that the act of creating art is precisely a kind of vocational emptying out of the self that is akin to the devoted revolutionary. Part 2, the limits of representation. One of the things the artists and the revolutionary have in common at this point is their non-representativeness, their ability not to incarnate other people or social groups, but to sacrifice humanity in the service of abstraction. One of the lessons of the novels of utopian crime is that it's worth living a little bit with these kinds of relatively antisocial political forms. Broadly speaking, desire to look for the representation of the masses is endemic to the theory of the novel as a form. Scholars are always searching for hidden crowds within the novel's domestic spaces, for groups standing behind individuals. So, for instance, David Koenig in Empty Houses seeks the repressed public space and social world of the theater within the novel's interiority. Readings like his desire to restore a lost social plenitude to our theories of fiction. They look to how the novel, against its apparent individualism, registers in its form the multitudes it cannot quite represent. The same is true of Alex Wallach's account of the way the singularity of the protagonist is under strain thanks to the pressure of minor characters standing in for the proletariat. If the 19th century realist novel, in these and many other accounts, strains to contain social plenitude, it's my argument that the modernist art novel has a different political weight. That is, these novels call our attention to other forms of the political that we might find in fiction. Utopian crime forces us to recognize that the work of activism doesn't always call up social plenitude. It may just as easily hollow out the social in the name of the future. In The Princess Casamassima, the protagonist's initiation into the more violent levels of revolution comes when he is whisked away from a public group gathering into a smaller, more secretive world. In The Secret Agent, the protagonist Verloc has devolved from using a powerful voice in front of crowds to working as a spy. He ultimately sacrifices his family for a bomb. Ngugi's A Grain of Wheat tracks the way those left behind suffer when the fighters of Mau Mau flee to the forest to launch a guerrilla struggle. When the protagonist of Devil on the Cross finally turns to action, she walks away from all the other characters alone. The social world is often sacrificed in these texts precisely in proportion to characters' involvement in revolutionary action. The image of the writer sequestered from the world, alone in the dark, isn't necessarily a withdrawal from history. It asks us to attend to more troubling, less comfortable political affects that may have been that have historically been integral to revolutionary movements. Rather than heartening scenes of mass organization, we see small secretive groups plotting murders that seldom go according to plan, willing to sacrifice everything for scarcely imaginable utopian futures. The novelist, like the conspirator, makes plots under cover of darkness. Such scenes can reflect not a retreat from politics, but instead a different form of it. In other words, the history of the novel can help us take a hard look at our own political blind spots, our tendency to look to social movements that avoid violence, or to imagine that those dire strategies might be countenanced in some other more benighted time and place, never here or now. Yet the work of creating mass movements, especially in the anti-colonial struggles of the sort that prompted much of the 20th century's concern with the novels of utopian crime, such as those in Algeria, Kenya, and South Africa, often ends up relying on those individual or coterie acts of radical violence. The larger body of the people often don't seem interested in revolution, at least at first. Although we tend to think in terms of the mobilization of mass movements, history's most powerful mass movements often grew out of coterie acts at first at odds with the public. We like to think of the history of the novel as a history of the felt absence of the multitudes who can't quite be represented in the forms of fiction. Utopian crime suggests something different, that the history of the art novel is the felt presence of the multitudes of the future, not as unrepresentable subjects, but as an audience. We're used to making parallels between literary forms and social structures. The vast majority of our theories for the relation between literature and politics have to do with the ways literature imagines or makes us imagine the shape of the world we inhabit or might inhabit. We look at how characters stand in for classes. We look at how private domestic space corresponds to a broader world. We look at literature's capacity to make us see injustices that exist, or we look at its capacity to make us think that the world might be other than it is. In a sense, we've assumed that the social value of literature has to do with the ways fiction can make us perceive the society we inhabit differently. I'm arguing today that the Anglophone art novel has, since its inception, been proximate to politics of a much more specific sense. That is, the difficulties of writing for the future reflect the kinds of dilemmas involved in the work of doing politics. The ideologies these texts are concerned with are not modes of understanding society, but pragmatic and moral debates about political action. This can enjoin us to look more closely at political actors of every type. I've focused on left-wing radicals in this project, but attending to literature's futurity as a model of political action rather than social representation can equally draw our attention to the compromising work of negotiation in a representative democracy. The modernist novels of utopian crime may look irremediably anti-democratic. It may look like political violence is the egoistic playground of self-interested actors. But I'm going to conclude by looking at a moment in the afterlives of this literary tradition where the enclosed, isolated labors of utopian crime were very much the province of a democratic movement. This is the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. The ANC's turn to violence occurred in the aftermath of the Sharpeville massacre of 1960, and most participants and current historians agree with Mandela's classic account of that decision in his speech at the Rivonia trial. Mandela argued that the ANC perceived that Black South Africans were disillusioned with nonviolence and that violence was likely to break out regardless of the ANC's action. Therefore, he said, the ANC founded the Spear of the Nation to channel and control the now inevitable course of violent revolt. In other words, South African anti-apartheid violence was not a product of radical revolutionaries seeking to drag the masses into the future, kicking and screaming. It was an attempt to channel and make useful a genuine mass impulse. Yet in the novels that depict the labor of underground activism in the period, the activists find themselves struggling with the same difficulties as many of the modernist and Russian characters I've mentioned. The Russian and Anglophone modernist novels of utopian crime punctuate South African literature in the period. Most famously, J.M. Coetzee's Master of Petersburg fictionalizes a period in Dostoevsky's life and imagines him having a series of confrontations with Nechayev. Andrei Brink's An Act of Terror includes multiple explicit references to Dostoevsky and uses repeated phrases from Conrad's The Secret Agent. Lewis and Cossey's Underground People has a character reading Under Western Eyes. But I'm going to speak for a moment about a few examples that don't use these explicit reference points. Even in these novels, we'll see political action, especially violence, seems to estrange its practitioners from the masses. For instance, in Sifos Apamla's A Ride on the Whirlwind, an operative shows up in the middle of the Soweto uprising to help plan an assassination. His presence immediately begins to sow discord amongst the student revolutionaries who fear the loss of their collective leadership. And in Alex Laguma's In the Fog of the Season's End, an in-country ANC agent who helps with recruitment and outreach finds himself at odds with a friend who's suddenly a little too nervous to provide an agreed upon place to stay for the night. The friend tells the agent that he was out of town. "We just got back, pal. Had a hell of a time at the beach." The agent was about to ask, "The colored beach?" We can see here the shadow of a story that isn't being told, one in which the day-to-day oppressions of apartheid, segregated beaches, lead to political consciousness. Instead, it's the opposite. For Buch's friend, day-to-day life erodes a commitment to action. The world through which Buch travels, always threatened with arrest, is not one in which everyday experience motivates individuals to act. Instead, his action sets himself apart from the majority of South Africans going about their lives. The critic Njabelo Ndebele once criticized Laguma for seeming to reduce the representation of South African life to the spectacle of oppression, arguing that, quote, "Even under the most oppressive of conditions, people are always trying and struggling to maintain a semblance of normal social order," end quote. This, Ndebele argued, was supposed to be literature's subject. In attending faithfully to the complexity of such struggles, literature might offer a foundation of imagining a post-apartheid future. But interactions like the one I'm quoting in The Fog of the Season's End suggest that Laguma knows quite well that people try to maintain fulfilling social worlds even under oppression. His novel argues that that instinct is itself part of the problem, that simply living one's life is not the seed of a better future, but instead a capitulation to the limitations of the present. Ndebele sees literature's faithful representation of ordinary life as the seed of a broader social imagination. Laguma suggests, by contrast, that in focusing on the breadth of our social imagination, we risk losing sight of the particular dilemmas of political action, which often, even in the best of causes, can set individuals apart from the world on whose behalf they act. The novel, I'm suggesting, can offer more than varying visions of the world we have or might have. It can ask us instead, what are you going to do about it? This is the real radical potential of literary fiction, not to make us see society differently, but to make us confront the tactics that might be required to change it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation, for your overwhelming presentation. Okay, I'm going to try to catch up some ideas so we can kind of have a little bit of debate. A ver, bueno, ha sido abrumador. Simplemente, bueno, vamos a intentar, han salido muchas ideas que tienen mucho que ver con algo de lo que salió ayer por la tarde en la conferencia de Marta Puixant. Hay ideas que nos pueden servir, que son nuevas para los estudios literarios que solemos hacer desde el hispanismo, que creo que nos pueden servir también a la hora de pensar esta idea de los escenarios comparados, ¿no? Y él ha hablado de la idea de futuridad como una herramienta de análisis. Ahora vamos a ver si podemos hablar un poco sobre esto. De la idea de pensar cómo los textos están escritos para una audiencia futura, ¿no? Y cómo esa audiencia futura está presente en los textos que se escriben, ¿no? Y cómo esa idea de futuridad está vinculada a la idea de revolución y de ahí la idea de que las novelas son artefactos políticos. Creo que esto es una idea bueno, bastante novedosa, de la que a lo mejor nos puede hablar un poco más. Aparecen también nociones como la de crime fiction o utopian crime, que bueno, son etiquetas que van surgiendo en los estudios literarios y que a lo mejor está bien que, no sé si vosotros los habéis trabajado, habéis oído hablar de ellos, a lo mejor está bien también, no sé, como mapas, como herramientas conceptuales que nos pueden servir. Luego, mientras, por supuesto, turno de preguntas, tanto en el chat como en la gente que está aquí, yo voy haciendo tiempo y voy soltando ideas, ¿vale? A ver si nos ayudan a arrancar. También está esta idea que desde los estudios culturales, desde los estudios de los afectos, se ha trabajado que esta idea de que los textos, más allá de la representación, los textos hacen cosas, ¿no? Los textos son prácticas que movilizan afectos, movilizan, digamos, algo que es del orden de lo político y no es únicamente del orden de lo literario, ¿no? O sea, siempre con este diálogo de lo privado y lo público. Y bueno, creo que también es muy interesante la idea de recepción que ha manejado Michela en su conferencia, como la novela, ella dice que la novela es algo más que la idea, va más allá de la idea de representación, ¿no? Y que justamente la noción de la novela como un artefacto político tiene que ver con trascender esa idea de que la novela simplemente representa a la sociedad, sino que también tiene la capacidad de cambiarla. Entonces, María Jesús, intento... Okay. So, Michaela, I was talking about, and there are some ideas that maybe you can help us to narrow down, just to help us to understand them better. Okay, is the idea of futurity that is in your works, in your latest works. Also, if you can explain a little bit more this idea of crime fiction and how your idea of utopian crime is inside this notion of crime fiction. And if you can also talk a little bit more about this idea of the novel, the idea of the problems of representation in novel, and how this confronting this idea can help us to understand literatures as something more than just a text. We can understand what texts do, not just what texts mean.
Okay, so I'm just trying to write down your questions. So first, you wanted to talk more about, want me to say a little more about futurity, and I'm happy to do that. my interest in futurity really stems from this sense that it started out as a purely literary interest, that there was a kind of sense that to attend to a literature text as moving across time was somehow antithetical to attending to its politics. That, you know, the idea that seeing a text as written for the future was seeing a text as sort of a timeless classic that has no relation to history. And that's why I think there's a vast open space for scholarship that looks at the way futurity isn't simply a kind of escape from time, but a different relation to a very historical understanding of time. So a lot of my work looks at varying ways authors sort of force themselves to think about what it means to write to people who are not the people of the present, whether that imagines a revolution to come, or whether that involves trying to theorize what might last about people even through historical changes. One thing that's really interesting about the Princess Casamassima, any of you who know Henry James know that he was irremediably hostile to most revolution, but Hyacinth, his protagonist, even when Hyacinth sort of decides that he doesn't want to be a revolutionary anymore, Hyacinth never loses faith that the revolution is coming. And one of the things I think is interesting about the modernist period is that many of these writers, they really thought that some kind of radical left-wing revolution may very well happen in England, in other places in the West that they were talking about, not just the one that most people could see on the horizon in Russia. And so that sense that they really might not know the history that was coming for them, I think is really important for understanding what somebody like James, who really wants to create an idea of the novel that can last into the future, what he's up to and how he thinks about doing that. So that's so futurity is a kind of vision of responsibility to provide something to a history that you know is not your own. Ultimately, is how I think about how futurity inflects the novel form in this period. In terms of crime fiction, thank you for asking that question. As you may know, I've sort of been in dialogue with people, including Marta, actually, about the kind of genre of global crime fiction, and its relation to these questions. One thing I will say is that there's a kind of sort of most of the novels I'm talking about don't fit easily into the format of crime fiction as a genre. Although in the modernist period, some of Conrad's novels were marketed in that way. They were marketed, alongside sort of fun spy potboilers. So that's a moment where you can see kind of this dream of a novel that could be both high art and a fun spy thriller at the same time. And of course, if you read The Secret Agent, it's not much fun as a thriller. And one of the things I've noticed in sort of doing more research on this is that as you get into the later parts of the 20th century, when these sort of genres spring apart more dramatically, when that possibility of kind of coincidence between the crime novel and literary fiction no longer seems quite as easy to hold on to, you get a kind of really different distorted mirror image of utopian crime. So if you look at, Ngugi wa Thiong'o's son, Mukoma wa Ngugi, has written both sort of pulpy crime novels, which have guns on their covers, and sort of literary fiction that has sort of sepia tone pearls on its cover. And they use similar plot lines, but in the pulpy versions, the utopian crime plot is the plot of neoliberal world order. It's a group of rich and powerful people. This is in his novel Black Star Nairobi, who decide to eliminate all the corrupt politicians in Kenya in order to make room for a better future. Whereas in his in his sort of more arty novel, Mrs. Shaw, utopian crime is committed on behalf of the oppressed. It's you know, an abused woman killing her husband, who is also an oppressive minister, and the actions of various other figures who lack governmental power. So I think what happens is that to the extent that the crime novel becomes a mass market genre, it tends to imagine crime as the province of the elite and powerful. And at least today, and there's lots of exceptions historically where sort of the novel of kind of urban crime, which does the opposite. But conversely, the kind of arty novel of crime, which turns towards the future, starts to imagine crime as the seeds of some alternate world to come. So that's I don't think of utopian crime as necessarily always connected to crime fiction as a genre, but when it does intersect and interact, I think that's the dynamic that I've seen. And then finally, you asked about the limits of representation in the argument. Yeah, I mean, so another place this comes out of is simply living through the Trump years in the US, and kind of hearing a lot of people on the left, you know, simply kind of say things that didn't quite seem fully accurate in analyzing the situation, such, you know, simply not just evoking the fact that, you know, Trump didn't get a majority of votes, but also kind of there seemed to be a fantasy that if just everybody could vote, if we had perfect representation of the population, we'd have single payer healthcare, or all the other good political priorities of the left in the US. But if you actually ask the American people whether they want the government to be the one paying for their healthcare, they mostly say no. And so I think it seemed important to me to try to start to think about political action as how an individual might change what the masses think, or not an individual, how a small group might change what the masses think. That had to get into our analysis somehow in a way that it didn't seem to be fully present. And I saw in kind of literary novel theory a version of the same problem, a kind of subtextual presumption that better representation was all that was needed to produce very radical change in the world, and a devaluation concomitantly of the work of doing politics and changing people's minds, as somehow you know, risking being elitist in a certain way. And I think I just really wanted to make a space to understand that politics is hard work, and it's a kind of work that I think the novel can speak to well, but it's something that a lot of the sort of vague left-wing discourse that I see in American conversations simply wasn't making space for. So that's where this kind of question about the limits of the representation came through, and what the kind of underlying motivation for me is.
Thank you so much. I don't know if alguien quiere preguntar algo en el chat o en la sala. Sí, María Ángeles.
Yo quería que le preguntaras también, aparte de lo que ha estado hablando y a partir del artículo teniendo en cuenta el futuro, si cree que además de las cuestiones de carácter temático, este planteamiento suyo propone como un segundo statement, un segundo nivel, un segundo momento en el significado de la ciencia ficción, de las narraciones posapocalípticas. Un segundo momento, me refiero en relación, esta podría ser la pregunta, si está proponiendo un segundo momento en cuanto a la forma y significado de las ficciones posapocalípticas o futuristas, un segundo momento distinto del que definió Frederick Jameson cuando definió la ciencia ficción como el futuro que habla de nuestro presente. Que da la sensación, no sé, puede que incluso lo tenga en la cabeza, que está definiendo un segundo momento en la ciencia ficción, ¿no? Donde el futuro es el protagonista y no el presente. El significado político de la ciencia ficción. Que si está proponiendo un segundo momento en relación con la afirmación de Frederick Jameson, el futuro habla de nuestro presente, se está proponiendo como una modificación o un segundo nivel en la historia de los géneros posapocalípticos, de las distopías, de la ciencia ficción en general, un segundo momento en relación con el que definió Frederick Jameson, dando protagonismo al presente, y ella está definiendo un momento en el que el protagonismo es del futuro, ¿no? Y por preguntarle una cuestión formal, una implicación de carácter genérico a estas consideraciones de la responsabilidad política, ¿no? Exactamente, que si ella es consciente o si lo está proponiendo deliberadamente ese giro de significado hacia el presente. Perdón, hacia el futuro. Jameson decía, el futuro habla de nuestro presente y ahora lo importante no es hablar del presente, lo que ella propone sino hablar del futuro. Si es consciente de eso y si además de estar hablando de cuestiones temáticas, ideológicas y políticas, podríamos estar hablando también de una cuestión historizable, ¿no? En la historia de los géneros distópicos.
No sé si tengo, creo que no tengo cámara ni tengo...
si quiere lo puedo intentar.
Okay. Hi, Michela. I don't know if you hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
No. Yeah, can you hear me? Yes?
Yes, I can hear you.
Excellent.
Can you not hear me?
No, but we cannot hear.
No,
Yeah, okay. We were talking here between the audience while talking about your very interesting lecture, and we were talking about well, in terms of Frederick Jameson, when he talks about the representation of future.
Yeah.
Talking about how you talk about the future at the present moment. What is the outcome of this? If you have considered this kind of representation in your studies.
What is the outcome of considering the future?
Yeah.
So I'm a scholar, and as are, I assume, most, if not all of you, and I do think part of scholarship is to some extent similar to some of the problems of futurity. You're trying to produce something that you think will be useful, but you also know that you don't know how it will be useful. I think one of my I can state hopes about what I think my scholarship will help do, but I also want to have some humility before what other people, what uses other people might make of it that I won't necessarily be able to see. But that said, I think I think I want a greater sense of a greater attention within the literary field to problems of political action, not just problems of what society ought to look like. I want it's my hope that we can understand the future as sort of not simply a kind of either extension of the present or a kind of fantasy of what whether dystopian or utopian of radical difference, but as a thing that we have a hand in creating, and that we have ethical responsibility towards. I've also written about the problems of writing in an era of climate change, in the sense of, authors trying to figure out whether what form of society will be around 100 years from now, on a global scale. So really that sense of instilling the future as a thing we can have ethical responsibility to, without necessarily thinking that we know what it actually is a key element of the project here. I'm not sure I fully understood your question, but that's my effort at answering what I thought I heard.
Thanks. We have another question.
Thank you so much. ¿Alguien más? No, en el chat.
Creo que hay algo en el chat.
No.
¿No?
Okay, we are out of time anyway, so thank you so much, Michela. It's been a pleasure having you here with us.
It's a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm really sorry that the time zone means that I have very limited ability to hear what else is going on at this exciting conference, because you have such a fabulous set of topics and people involved. But thank you
so much.
Good evening.
Vale, pues vamos a hacer un breve descanso y volvemos a las 6:30.